Hello, this is Dr. David Farmer. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Spirituality Justice Today. And happy Father's Day to those who have the joy of being honored by their children, those fathers who have the joy of being honored by their children in a couple of days. Also, I'd like to express a tribute to those fathers who work tirelessly to make the world a better place for their kids and the kids of others. There are lots of great parents in the world, mothers and fathers, whose tireless dedication to a better world rests in their devotion to their kids and the kids of others. So for this weekend, dads, happy Father's Day. It is heartening to see that some minuscule steps forward are taking place in response to the further abuse of black people by the wider citizenry protesting. Oh, my goodness, it's too little too late. Yes, yes, we know, and not nearly enough to assuage the consciences of the white people who let it go on too ridiculously long. But baby steps, and we must build on those. And I'm talking to my white sisters and brothers. Black Lives Matter, thank goodness, by the way, since all the first humans were people of color. Update your National Geographic subscription if you doubt me. But even if that were not the case, black lives have always mattered and always will. We must live accordingly. Radley Balco is an investigative reporter for the Washington Post, as best I can determine currently. He also has written for the Huffington Post and other major publications. On June 7th, in the Washington Post, I stumbled across this headline, which I've circled here. An entire Florida SWAT team resigned last week. It's for the best. I wondered where in the world he was going with this, so I took some time to scan it, and that caught me. I read it in very careful detail. I was so moved and so disturbed that I wrote an email message to this gifted and courageous reporter. The resignation of the members of the SWAT team who left the SWAT team but not the Broward County Police Force. Their shenanigans and their abuse of citizens was just the tip of the iceberg. This brief article was filled with references to um, questionable and perhaps illegal activities on the part of this SWAT team and maybe companion SWAT teams around the country um, to acquire, for example, combat gear from the federal government by jacking up numbers, that is, giving false numbers of criminal records to cause the federal government to believe that things were worse than they actually are. please make reference to the article yourself so that you can find the reporter's information and references. But in any case, whether you buy into all the details or not, it is this reference to the resignation of the SWAT team is the tip of the iceberg. And I wrote to Mr. Balco and said, thank you for your thorough and thoroughly disturbing article on the SWAT team's resignation, as well as much background information about Florida police brutality. You've helped me make some decisions about where not to retire. Of course, I know Florida is not heartbroken, that I probably will not be heading that way for retirement. Continuing my little note, other than more reports on murder where black lives don't matter, and the widespread practice of police department lies in order to get freebie federal combat gear, I was most disgusted by the scripture passage on the Broward County Sheriff's SWAT team uniform shoulder patch. Romans 13:4. Actually, we need to read 3 with 4 to get the whole picture. Continuing again with my note to the reporter, the assumed interpretation of the Apostle Paul's comments on Nero's Rome, while Nero was Paul-friendly and Christian-friendly, if in fact there was an actual Christianity established when Paul dictated his comments to the followers of Jesus in Rome, certainly were not the same feelings Paul had about Nero or government when Nero ordered or allowed Paul to be executed for nothing more than exercising his religious freedom, a practice with which Nero theoretically had no complaint as long as loyalty to the emperor was not compromised. By the time nearly blind Paul was being led from a prison cell in Rome to a crucifixion site where he would be put to death by the Roman government, as had Jesus before him, he most certainly did not think all government entities were appointed by God, empowered by God, or approved by God. Again, Mr. Balco, thank you. And I included a little side note to the Broward County Sheriff's Department SWAT team. I found an email address, I think, for the media department, but no one else down there. And I attempted to send it to that address. We'll send a hard copy from our office early next week if we think the email hasn't gotten through. To the Broward County Sheriff's Department SWAT team, what a gross breach of separation of synagogue, church, mosque, and state, and the most basic principles of biblical interpretation. God most definitely has not endorsed any murder by any person at any time in a uniform or not. Neither a uniform nor abuse of Scripture justifies or ever has justified doing harm to a human being of any ethnicity when force is necessary to apprehend somebody who's a true danger to her or his fellow citizens. The least possible amount of resistance is the proper course of action. Don't you dare bring God into your evil. God does not endorse murder. God does not endorse racism. Keep all references to religion off your uniforms. That's the true American way. It would be well, the note's over, by the way, but it would be well for all persons serving the nation, particularly in a role of paid service, to learn to read the Constitution and the Bible, which informed those who prepared the Constitution, whether or not they plan to use the Bible to guide their lives or not, whether they choose to use the Bible to guide their lives or not. Police officers who wish to carry Bibles with them have every right to do so, in their pockets, in their boots, in their helmets, absolutely, but no right whatsoever to wear Bible references on their uniforms or patches. No Hebrew scripture references, no Christian scripture references, no Quranic references, or any other scripture reference from any religion. Just for a little comparison and background information, I have 3 translations of Romans chapter 13, verses 3 and 4. We're not going to look at those in detail, but the English Standard Version, the New International Version, and the Good News Translation. Let's go with the English Standard Version, since I have it here first. And by the way, none of these refer to police officers or protective services. These refer to the rulers themselves. That's one problem, but it's not the only problem. And here's what Paul dictated. It's important to remember that because Paul was too blind to write for himself. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. As I said in my notes, this was written at a time when Paul thought Nero and the Roman government approved of him and approved of the developing Christian movement. In fact, Paul thought Rome was giving the developing Christian movement lots of breathing room to grow and develop. But by the time, say a decade had passed, Nero found Paul to be a troublemaker, and some of the groups he got together to hear preaching and to talk about Christian values or Jesus-like values, Nero perceived threatening in the same way Tiberius had felt about Jesus. And so Paul's execution was ordered. And by that time, Paul felt much more about government like John did, who wrote the visions of the book of Revelation. And interestingly enough, the 13th chapter, where the government was perceived by John to be demonic and evil. The government isn't automatically all good or all bad. In a democracy, Citizens have power and influence to elect the kind of people who make it either good or evil. Not all people in the world and not all people throughout history have had such opportunity for influence. By the time Paul was being escorted to a Roman cross, he did not think leaders were instruments of God, nor those in service to rulers, such as the equivalent of police officers. I've already read my note for you to the Broward County Sheriff's Department SWAT team. Here it is if you want to look over it.